They did not collapse under the weight of foreign armies marching through their gates, nor were they crushed by a conquering empire eager to claim their land, because their cities show no signs of burning, no layers of ash, no mass graves, and no monuments celebrating defeated enemies or fallen kings. And yet, despite every advantage history usually grants a long-lasting civilization, one of the most advanced societies of the ancient world slowly and inexplicably disappeared. Nearly 4,000 years ago, while monumental pyramids were rising along the Nile and written laws were being carved into stone in Mesopotamia, a vast and highly organized civilization flourished across the plains of what is now Pakistan and northwest India. Its cities were planned with mathematical precision, its streets aligned in perfect grids, and its homes equipped with drainage systems, toilets, and water management infrastructure that would not be matched again for thousands of years. There were no towering palaces dominating the skyline, no grand temples ruling the urban core, and no clear evidence of powerful kings, standing armies, or centralized authority. By every conventional measure of historical success, this civilization should have endured for centuries longer than it did. But instead of collapsing in a moment of chaos or violence, it began to fade in a way that left no dramatic story carved into stone. The cities gradually emptied, long-distance trade networks quietly fractured, and urban life dissolved as people walked away from settlements their ancestors had carefully built and maintained for generations. For decades, scholars searched for familiar explanations: invaders, internal decay, social unrest, or cultural decline, but none of these theories could explain the silence left behind. Only recently has a far more unsettling possibility emerged, uncovered not in ancient texts, but in ice cores taken from distant mountains, sediments buried beneath vanished riverbeds, and chemical signatures trapped inside cave formations. Together, they point toward an invisible force powerful enough to reshape monsoon systems, drain life-giving rivers, and quietly dismantle an entire civilization, without a single battle ever being fought. This was not just the end of the Indus Valley Civilization. It was one of the earliest warnings humanity ever ignored. To understand why the collapse of the Indus Valley Civilization remains one of history's most unsettling mysteries, it is first necessary to understand just how unlikely its failure truly was. This was not a fragile society balanced on the edge of survival, nor a short-lived experiment in urban life. It was a civilization that had solved many of the problems that would plague human societies for thousands of years after its disappearance. At its height, the Indus Valley Civilization stretched across more than 1 million square kilometers, making it one of the largest civilizations of the ancient world. From the foothills of the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea, hundreds of cities, towns, and villages formed a tightly connected cultural and economic network. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dhalavira, Lot Hau, and dozens of lesser-known sites followed the same underlying principles of urban design, suggesting not chaos or improvisation, but long-term planning and shared knowledge passed down over generations. What set the Indus cities apart was not their size alone, but their extraordinary attention to organization and sustainability. Streets were laid out in carefully measured grids, aligned with cardinal directions. Residential areas were separated from industrial zones, workshops, and public spaces in a way that modern city planners would immediately recognize. Homes, even modest ones, were built with standardized baked bricks, indicating strict quality control and an advanced understanding of construction techniques. Water, the most critical resource for any civilization, was not treated as an afterthought but as the foundation of daily life. Wells were common, sometimes shared by just a handful of households, ensuring reliable access to clean water. Sophisticated drainage systems ran beneath the streets, carrying wastewater away from homes and preventing contamination. These were not symbolic achievements, they were practical solutions refined over centuries, suggesting a society deeply aware of its environment and its limits. Equally striking is what the Indus Valley Civilization lacked. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, there is no clear evidence of grand palaces, royal tombs, or monuments glorifying rulers. Weapons exist, but not in quantities or contexts that suggest constant warfare or militaristic expansion. Artifacts point instead to trade, craftsmanship, and daily life, weights and measures standardized across vast distances, seals used for commerce, and goods moving between cities with remarkable consistency. This absence of overt hierarchy has led many scholars to believe that the Indus system was unusually decentralized. Power, if it existed, was likely distributed among councils, merchant groups, or local authorities rather than concentrated in the hands of divine kings. Such a structure, in theory, should have made the civilization more adaptable, more resilient, and less vulnerable to sudden political collapse. Economically, the Indus people were deeply integrated into regional and long-distance trade networks. Goods from the Indus have been found in Mesopotamian cities, while materials such as lapis lazuli, copper, and shells moved efficiently across the subcontinent. This was not an isolated culture living at the mercy of a single crop or river, but a diversified system with multiple sources of food, income, and exchange. Agriculture, too, reflected careful adaptation rather than reckless exploitation. Farmers cultivated wheat, barley, pulses, and cotton, often using seasonal flooding to replenish soil fertility. There is little evidence of extreme deforestation or land exhaustion during the civilization's peak, suggesting that environmental management was, at least for a time, sustainable. Taken together, these features paint a picture that defies the usual narrative of ancient collapse. The Indus Valley Civilization was technologically advanced, economically connected, socially stable, and environmentally aware. It had endured for centuries, weathering smaller fluctuations and regional changes without losing its core identity. And yet, by around 1900 BCE, something fundamental began to change. Urban centers that had thrived for generations started to shrink. Brick quality declined. Long-distance trade weakened. Standardized systems that once linked the civilization together began to fragment. People did not vanish overnight, but the carefully maintained urban world they had built was slowly being abandoned. The most unsettling part is not that the Indus Valley Civilization declined, but that it did so without leaving behind the usual fingerprints of disaster. There is no clear evidence of invasion, no widespread destruction layers, no sudden demographic collapse. The systems that should have protected this civilization, its planning, adaptability, and decentralized structure, were not enough. This raises a troubling question, one that historians struggled with for decades: if a civilization this stable, this advanced, and this well adapted to its environment could unravel so quietly, then what kind of force could have pushed it beyond recovery? The answer does not lie in human conflict or political failure, but in a slow-moving transformation that unfolded far beyond city walls, one that altered the very rhythms of the natural world the Indus people depended on, an invisible shift that turned their greatest strength into an unrecognized vulnerability. For centuries beyond recorded memory, the Indus Valley Civilization existed within a climate system that felt stable enough to be trusted without question. The seasonal monsoon arrived with a reliability that shaped every aspect of life, from when fields were planted to where cities were built. This predictability was not enforced by rulers or recorded in laws, it was absorbed into the collective understanding of how the world worked. That understanding began to fail. The shift did not announce itself through catastrophe. There was no single year of total crop failure, no sudden drought that forced people to flee their homes. Instead, the monsoon began to behave differently in ways that were subtle enough to be dismissed, yet persistent enough to matter. Rains arrived later than expected, withdrew earlier than usual, or fell in erratic bursts that soaked the surface but failed to recharge rivers and groundwater. Each deviation seemed minor on its own. Together, they formed a pattern no generation had prepared for. For a civilization built on long-term environmental balance rather than aggressive control of nature, this change carried serious consequences. Much of the Indus region relied on monsoon rainfall to sustain river flow, replenish aquifers, and trigger seasonal flooding that renewed agricultural soils. When the monsoon weakened or grew unpredictable, rivers did not fail immediately, but they began to respond in slow, measurable ways. Channels narrowed. Floodplains received less sediment. Seasonal water levels fluctuated beyond familiar limits. At first, the system absorbed the strain. Farmers adjusted planting schedules, experimenting with timing in hopes of matching the new rhythm of rainfall. Wells were dug deeper as groundwater levels dropped, and irrigation networks were pushed harder to compensate for reduced surface water. Marginal lands were brought into cultivation to offset declining yields elsewhere. These adaptations worked just well enough to delay alarm. But adaptation has limits, especially when the conditions demanding adaptation continue to worsen. As unpredictability increased, agriculture shifted from routine production to calculated risk. Decisions that had once been based on generations of observation now carried uncertainty. Plant too early, and the rains might fail. Plant too late, and the soil could dry out before crops matured. Each season became a gamble, and repeated gambles eroded confidence as much as they eroded yields. The real danger was not starvation, but the loss of surplus. Urban life depends on surplus more than abundance. Cities require extra food to support craftsmen, traders, builders, administrators, and the infrastructure that binds them together. As agricultural output became less reliable, surplus shrank quietly. Food still reached cities, but margins narrowed, and narrow margins make complex systems fragile. Urban centers began to feel the pressure indirectly. Construction projects slowed. Brick quality declined as resources were conserved rather than invested. Maintenance of drainage systems, reservoirs, and public spaces became irregular, not because knowledge or skill had vanished, but because priorities had shifted toward immediate survival rather than long-term planning. Trade networks, once finely balanced, also began to weaken. Regions that produced less surplus exported fewer goods. Fewer goods meant fewer exchanges, and fewer exchanges reduced the economic glue that held distant cities together. Standardized weights, measures, and materials, hallmarks of Indus unity, started to show regional variation as coordination loosened. The most dangerous phase of this transformation was its invisibility. At no point did the Indus people experience a clear signal that their civilization had entered crisis. Cities remained inhabited. Fields were still cultivated. Markets continued to function. Yet beneath this surface continuity, resilience was being drained from the system year after year. The monsoon had not disappeared, but it was no longer predictable. And predictability, more than volume, had been the foundation of Indus' success. Without it, planning lost precision, coordination weakened, and the assumptions that underpinned urban life began to erode. What made this especially perilous was the slow pace of change. Each generation inherited a world slightly less reliable than the one before it, making it difficult to distinguish long-term transformation from natural variability. By the time the trend became undeniable, the civilization had already reorganized itself around lower expectations and reduced complexity. The monsoon had once been a partner that enabled stability and growth. Now it had become an uncertain force, reshaping rivers, agriculture, and urban life without intent or malice. And as this instability persisted, its effects began to concentrate on the civilization's most critical dependency. Because when rainfall changes, rivers do not argue. They simply respond. And the rivers of the Indus world were beginning to withdraw. By the time the monsoon's rhythm had begun to falter in the Indus Valley, the problem had already escalated beyond local variability. What the civilization was experiencing was part of a global climatic shift, an invisible, relentless force that modern scientists now call the 4.2 kiloyear climate event, a prolonged period of aridity and instability beginning around 2200 BCE and lasting for centuries. Unlike sudden natural disasters that leave unmistakable scars, this event operated quietly but inexorably, reshaping landscapes, rivers, and human societies across continents. The Indus people could not have recognized it. For generations, rainfall, river flow, and harvests had formed patterns that were trusted as permanent. Suddenly, these patterns began to unravel in ways that were gradual but relentless. What once had been the predictable arrival of rain and river flow became erratic. Some years, the monsoon arrived late, other years, it withdrew early. Rivers swelled unpredictably and then receded too soon. To the Indus farmers, it may have felt like mere bad luck, but the phenomenon was global, and the stakes were far higher than any single harvest. Evidence of this climate event comes from places the Indus people could never have imagined: glaciers in distant mountains, lake sediments buried deep beneath dried basins, and chemical signatures trapped in stalagmites from caves. Across these natural archives, a clear signal emerges: a shift toward prolonged dryness, a weakening of rainfall patterns, and an overall increase in environmental stress that did not respect political boundaries. In Mesopotamia, empires faltered under famine and political collapse. In Egypt, the Nile's floods became unpredictable, contributing to social unrest. Across the eastern Mediterranean, settlements were abandoned, populations migrated, and trade networks dissolved. The Indus Valley was not isolated, it was part of a broader pattern of planetary disruption. For the Indus Valley specifically, the effects were devastating. The rivers, lifelines of urban life, became increasingly unreliable. The Gagarhakra system, which had once supported hundreds of settlements, gradually transitioned from a perennial water source to a seasonal trickle, leaving towns that had flourished on its banks struggling to survive. Fields that had once received predictable floodwater now faced irregular moisture. Soil fertility declined, groundwater levels dropped, and wells that had once been sufficient required greater depth and effort to reach water. Agriculture, the backbone of the civilization, began to falter. Surpluses that fed cities, artisans, and long-distance trade networks started to shrink. Urban centers that had depended on consistent inflows of food, raw materials, and commerce began to experience stress. Craftsmen produced less, standardized weights and measures lost precision, and trade routes slowly disintegrated under the weight of environmental uncertainty. What made the 4.2-kilo-year event uniquely dangerous was its duration and invisibility. It unfolded over decades, each year slightly different from the last, making it nearly impossible for the Indus people to recognize the long-term pattern. Incremental failures were misattributed to local circumstances or chance, and communities adapted in small ways, digging deeper wells, adjusting planting schedules, or shifting crops, without addressing the systemic shift occurring across the subcontinent. By gradually undermining the rivers and altering rainfall, the 4.2-kilo-year climate event attacked the very foundations of the civilization: water, food, and trade. It did not demand swords or armies, it required only time, persistence, and subtle shifts in the environment. By the time the consequences were unmistakable, much of the urban system had already been weakened. The Indus Valley Civilization was entering a phase from which recovery would become increasingly impossible, a slow-motion unraveling that no one living at the time could fully comprehend. It was a silent, invisible adversary. No walls could defend against it, no treaties could appease it, and no human ingenuity could fully counteract it. The people of the Indus Valley had survived for centuries by reading and responding to their environment, but the 4.2-kilo-year event was unlike anything they had ever faced. It was the beginning of the end, a drawn-out, quiet erosion of everything they had built, leaving cities, rivers, and entire ways of life on a precarious edge. And while the civilization still existed, the stage was set for a transformation that would leave its urban heartlands abandoned and its grand cities silent, a warning that nature's slow hand can be just as lethal as any invading army. Rivers were the lifeblood of the Indus Valley Civilization. They were more than channels of water, they were the veins through which the civilization's entire economy, agriculture, and daily life flowed. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dhalavira, and countless smaller settlements were all strategically built along riverbanks, not randomly, but according to patterns honed over centuries of observation and experience. These rivers dictated when crops could be planted, where cities could expand, and even how trade networks were organized. For generations, people assumed these waterways would remain reliable. That assumption, once so safe, began to crumble. It did not happen suddenly. There were no violent floods that washed away neighborhoods, no storms that flattened entire cities. Instead, the rivers began to retreat, slowly and invisibly, as if withdrawing deliberately from the civilization that depended on them. Seasonal flows that once nourished fields became intermittent. Channels that had provided irrigation for centuries narrowed or shifted, leaving settlements increasingly isolated from their lifeblood. The Gagarhakra River, once a major artery connecting hundreds of communities, gradually became little more than a seasonal stream, unable to support the density of people who had thrived along its banks. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Farmers could no longer rely on natural flooding to replenish their fields, and irrigation systems, carefully designed to distribute water evenly, began to fail. Wells, which had long ensured a steady supply, required constant maintenance and deeper digging as water tables fell. Agricultural yields shrank, not catastrophically at first, but enough to strain the surplus that cities depended on. Without reliable water, the delicate balance that had supported urban life for centuries started to tilt. Urban centers, which had grown dense and complex precisely because rivers allowed them to thrive, began to feel the pressure. Public buildings, streets, and drainage systems required consistent water to function properly. As the rivers receded, maintenance faltered. Brick quality declined as resources were redirected toward survival. Neighborhoods that once buzzed with activity slowly emptied, leaving streets and markets eerily quiet. The cities were not destroyed in a battle, they were abandoned gradually, as people walked away from homes that had been occupied for generations. Trade networks, which relied on rivers to transport goods efficiently, began to fragment. Coastal ports became more isolated from inland production centers. Long-distance commerce that had once connected the Indus with Mesopotamia and beyond dwindled as rivers no longer provided reliable routes. Localized economies emerged, but they lacked the cohesion and efficiency that had once made the civilization remarkable. The loss of rivers effectively rewired the economy from the bottom up. The most remarkable aspect of this transformation was its quietness. Unlike civilizations toppled by war or invasion, there were no mass graves, no walls breached by armies, no evidence of violent conquest. The retreat of the rivers was a silent adversary. It forced adaptation, migration, and decentralization, yet it left little trace in the archaeological record that could tell future generations the precise moment the lifeline broke. Communities responded as best they could, moving settlements closer to still-flowing tributaries or downsizing urban cores to match dwindling resources. Smaller, more flexible villages replaced sprawling cities, but the complex urban culture that had defined the Indus Valley, the uniformity of brick sizes, the precision of city grids, the standardized weights and measures, began to dissolve. Civilization was not ending with a bang, it was dissolving quietly, reshaped by water's slow withdrawal. By the time the full scope of the environmental changes was apparent, much of the Indus urban system had already reorganized itself. Cities that had once been thought permanent were now ghostly shadows of their former selves, standing as silent monuments to a society that had mastered planning, engineering, and adaptation, but had ultimately relied on a fragile relationship with nature. The rivers had not been defeated by humans, but humans had been rendered powerless by the gradual vanishing of the rivers themselves. It was a collapse without a battle, without heroes or villains, a quiet unmaking of civilization orchestrated entirely by the subtle, unstoppable retreat of water. And as the Indus people moved to adapt, migrate, or abandon their cities, they became part of a broader story, the slow, inevitable transformation of one of the world's first great urban societies, forced to confront a natural adversary they could neither negotiate with nor defeat. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were the jewels of the Indus Valley Civilization, cities that embodied centuries of planning, organization, and human ingenuity. Streets laid out in precise grids, houses with private wells and bathrooms, public baths, and advanced drainage systems, these were not the marks of a fragile society. These were cities built to last. And yet, like all great civilizations before them, they were not immune to forces beyond their control. The threat was invisible at first. There were no invading armies marching on city gates, no fires sweeping through neighborhoods, no political coup to disrupt daily life. Instead, the threat came quietly from the environment itself. The rivers and monsoon rains that had nourished these cities began to falter. Water, once the lifeblood of agriculture, trade, and urban infrastructure, started to become unreliable. Wells required deeper digging, reservoirs filled less, and the intricate drainage systems that had kept streets and homes dry became less effective. In Harappa, evidence shows that public buildings and streets gradually fell into disrepair. Bricks used for construction lost their uniformity, suggesting that maintenance was being deprioritized as resources were stretched thin. Mohenjo-daro, often considered the most sophisticated of the Indus cities, tells a similar story. Granaries that once stored vast surpluses of food show signs of irregular use. Neighborhoods that had been bustling with trade, artisans, and craftsmen became increasingly fragmented. People were still living in these cities, but the systems that had allowed them to thrive were weakening quietly but steadily. The problem was not just infrastructure, it was survival. Agriculture, the foundation of urban life, was failing in ways that could not be immediately reversed. The monsoon's inconsistency meant that fields no longer produced the predictable surpluses required to sustain dense urban populations. Trade networks faltered as resources dwindled. Craftsmen, dependent on citywide surplus and exchange, found themselves increasingly isolated. Daily life continued, but the margin for error, the invisible buffer that had allowed complex urban society to exist, was disappearing. What makes this period particularly haunting is the silence of the collapse. Unlike civilizations destroyed by conquest or conflict, there is no evidence of mass violence, no burned palaces, no decisive moments of defeat. Instead, the water simply stopped coming in the quantities and reliability that had sustained city life. It was a gradual suffocation, a quiet, relentless unraveling that forced adaptation, migration, and eventual abandonment. By the end of this transformation, both Harappa and Mohenjo-daro had lost the characteristics that made them remarkable. Streets once lined with organized homes and public baths fell into partial disuse. Standardized building practices eroded. Granaries emptied. Trade diminished. Residents moved toward areas where water was still accessible or left the region entirely, seeking more sustainable environments. Cities that had been symbols of human ingenuity were now reminders of nature's quiet, unstoppable power. The collapse of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro demonstrates a critical truth about the Indus Valley Civilization. Its downfall was not dramatic or sudden, but it was inevitable once the fundamental balance between human society and environmental resources was disrupted. Water, which had supported life for centuries, became the ultimate arbiter. No walls, no governance, no planning could hold back the consequences of vanishing rivers and inconsistent rains. And as the people left these cities behind, they carried with them not just their possessions, but the knowledge that survival depended on the landscape, and that even the most sophisticated societies were powerless when the environment itself turned against them. The day the water stopped was not a day marked on a calendar, nor recorded in stone. It was a slow, invisible process, yet it was decisive. It set the stage for the final unraveling of one of history's greatest civilizations. Unlike many ancient civilizations, the Indus Valley never left evidence of war as a defining force. There were no fortified walls with evidence of sieges, no weapons stockpiled in anticipation of invasion, and no mass graves indicating violent conquest. Even as cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro began to falter, the archaeological record is strikingly silent. No armies clashed. No rebellion erupted. The Indus people did not fight back, not because they were weak, but because the enemy they faced was invisible, silent, and unstoppable, the environment itself. This silence is remarkable precisely because human societies, when threatened, almost always respond with conflict. Across the world, scarcity triggers competition, and competition triggers violence. But the Indus civilization appears to have bypassed this predictable pattern. There is no sign of large-scale confrontation over dwindling water supplies, no evidence of territorial disputes escalating into battles. Instead, the response was pragmatic, quiet, and ultimately tragic: adaptation, relocation, and abandonment. The reasons for this non-violent response are complex. First, the Indus cities were highly decentralized. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, there were no visible kings, armies, or ruling elites capable of organizing mass resistance. Power was likely distributed across councils, guilds, and merchant networks, which may have made coordinated defensive action impossible even if the population had recognized the crisis. Second, the nature of the threat was fundamentally different from an invading force. When water disappears, there is nothing to fight. Rivers do not retreat because of fear, and rainfall does not respond to persuasion. The civilization faced an adversary that could not be negotiated with, bribed, or subdued. Moreover, the Indus people had a long history of environmental adaptation. For centuries, they had developed sophisticated water management systems, diversified crops, and urban planning strategies that had allowed them to thrive under shifting seasonal conditions. This history of success may have created a sense of resilience, an implicit belief that adaptation could solve any problem. But the 4.2 kilo-year climate event and the retreat of rivers were beyond incremental adjustment. Small adaptations could no longer compensate for systemic failure. Evidence of gradual abandonment supports this interpretation. Houses were left partially occupied, streets slowly emptied, and trade networks fragmented. The civilization did not crumble suddenly, it faded, one neighborhood and one settlement at a time. People moved closer to still viable water sources, or they dispersed into less densely populated regions. This migration was a rational, survival-driven choice, not a response to conflict. In this way, the Indus people demonstrated a form of collective intelligence. They recognized the limits of what could be changed and acted accordingly. Fighting back against the forces of nature would have been futile, and they did not waste lives on a battle they could not win. Instead, they adapted to the reality they faced, slowly, quietly, and without dramatic resistance. Yet this very pragmatism left the civilization vulnerable to gradual collapse. Unlike societies that resist and then recover from disasters, the Indus Valley lacked mechanisms to centralize resources or reorganize at scale in response to environmental collapse. Decentralization, which had once been a strength, became a weakness in the face of a silent, pervasive threat. By the time it became undeniable that rivers were shrinking, fields were failing, and urban centers were becoming unsustainable, the Indus people had already begun abandoning their cities. There was no dramatic fight, no epic battle recorded in clay or stone, only the quiet dismantling of a civilization, brick by brick, street by street, as the land itself withdrew its support. The Indus Valley Civilization did not fall because of human failure, it fell because it faced a force humans could neither challenge nor negotiate with. And in that, it offers a chilling lesson: not all enemies leave scars visible to history, and sometimes the most powerful adversary is the one that cannot be confronted at all. As the rivers of the Indus Valley dwindled and the monsoon became unreliable, entire populations were forced to make a choice they had never faced before: stay and risk famine, disease, and economic collapse, or leave everything behind in search of more reliable lands. Unlike war or conquest, the threat they faced could not be negotiated or fought. It demanded movement, migration, and profound change. Slowly, quietly, the people of the Indus Valley became some of the world's first known climate refugees. This movement was neither sudden nor uniform. Cities did not empty overnight, nor did entire regions simultaneously vanish. Instead, migration was a gradual, piecemeal process. Families and communities evaluated local water availability, soil fertility, and trade opportunities, and made the difficult decision to relocate. Some moved only a few kilometers to follow still-flowing tributaries or better rainfall zones. Others journeyed further, eastward toward the fertile plains of the Ganges or south toward coastal regions where water and food were more reliable. The archaeological record captures hints of this exodus. Settlements along the Ghaggar Hakra and other now dry riverbeds show layers of abandonment. Houses were left partially occupied, granaries emptied, streets gradually fell into disuse. In some areas, pottery, tools, and personal items were deliberately buried or left behind as people relocated. There was no chaos, no mass violence, but there was urgency, a quiet desperation. Each departure was a negotiation with survival itself. These migrations had profound social consequences. Communities that had been tightly connected through trade, governance, and shared infrastructure became dispersed. Standardization of weights, measures, and brick sizes, which had defined Indus cities, broke down as people spread into smaller, localized settlements. Cultural cohesion weakened. Urban expertise in engineering, planning, and sanitation could no longer be maintained on the scale the civilization had achieved. The term, climate refugee, feels modern, but it applies perfectly to the people of the Indus Valley. Their displacement was caused not by conquest, not by famine alone, and not by disease and isolation, but by a slow environmental transformation that made established cities unsustainable. They were forced to abandon homes and livelihoods, adapt to new regions, and create new ways of living under unpredictable conditions. Their migration was a survival strategy, a human response to nature's silent but inexorable pressure. This movement also reshaped the broader subcontinent. New settlements sprang up along the Ganges plains, in river valleys that still provided reliable water, and along the coasts where maritime resources could supplement agriculture. Populations became more dispersed and less centralized, signaling the decline of the Indus urban core. The great cities, once the beating heart of civilization, faded into memory while smaller, adaptive communities carried forward fragments of its culture. Perhaps the most striking lesson from this chapter of history is the quiet courage of adaptation. There were no battles, no heroics in the traditional sense, only human ingenuity and resilience facing a problem that could not be solved by swords or walls. Migration was not failure, it was a calculated response to a problem that was, in many ways, impossible to fight. And yet, while the individuals and families survived, the civilization itself, the system of interconnected cities, trade networks, and standardized infrastructure, was irreversibly weakened. The story of the Indus climate refugees is a sobering reminder that civilizations, no matter how advanced, are never fully insulated from nature. Environmental forces can compel change faster than human governance, and survival often requires leaving behind the achievements of generations. In the case of the Indus Valley, this exodus was not heroic, but it was necessary, a quiet surrender to an adversary that could not be seen, only experienced. The silent dispersal of people from Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and other urban centers marks a turning point. The Indus Valley Civilization, once a pinnacle of urban sophistication, was entering its final phase, a transformation driven not by conquest, but by climate, where survival demanded mobility, flexibility, and a willingness to leave behind the familiar. The story of the Indus Valley Civilization is more than a tale of cities abandoned and rivers withdrawn. It is a story that carries hidden lessons, lessons that reach across millennia to warn us about the fragile relationship between human society and the environment. Unlike the collapses driven by war, conquest, or sudden natural disasters, the decline of the Indus was quiet, drawn out, and subtle, unfolding over centuries with a pace almost imperceptible to those living through it. Its secret lies in the very forces that made it extraordinary: the reliance on careful planning, urban sophistication, and an intimate synchronization with the natural world. At its peak, the Indus Valley Civilization seemed almost invincible. Its cities were feats of engineering, meticulously planned on precise grids, with streets aligned to cardinal directions, houses equipped with private wells and bathrooms, and drainage systems that rivaled anything in the ancient world. Standardized bricks and construction techniques gave uniformity across vast distances, while trade networks spanned hundreds of kilometers, linking inland urban centers with distant ports. Its economy was diverse, its governance decentralized yet effective, and its society remarkably uniform across its territory. For generations, it had mastered the balance between human ambition and the natural systems on which life depended. Yet, in that very perfection lay its vulnerability. The civilization's strength, its dependence on stable natural systems, predictable rivers, and the rhythm of the monsoon, became a subtle weakness once those systems shifted. This is the first hidden lesson: even highly sophisticated societies can be undone not by sudden catastrophes, but by slow, invisible environmental change. The Indus people had survived centuries of variable rainfall and shifting river courses, thanks to ingenuity, infrastructure, and careful adaptation. They had built reservoirs, dug wells, and optimized agriculture to harness the monsoon and sustain cities. But the 4.2 kilo-year climate event disrupted the balance at a scale and duration that incremental human adjustments could not counter. Rivers shrank, groundwater levels fell, and monsoon patterns shifted unpredictably. Adaptation could no longer keep pace with change, survival strategies became insufficient, and the civilization's urban core began a slow, irreversible decline. Another hidden lesson lies in the nature of resilience. The Indus civilization was decentralized, egalitarian, and cooperative, qualities that should have made it more adaptable than centralized empires. Yet decentralization also meant there was no overarching authority capable of orchestrating a large-scale response to environmental stress. Cooperation sustained communities through ordinary challenges, but it could not conjure water where none existed. The civilization's social sophistication, impressive though it was powerless against a slow, persistent erosion of environmental reliability. In other words, no human system, no matter how advanced, can override nature's limits. The collapse also highlights the danger of invisibility. Unlike earthquakes or invasions, which strike suddenly and force immediate responses, the gradual drying of rivers and declining rainfall was almost imperceptible from year to year. Generations experienced minor hardships and adapted incrementally, assuming each challenge was temporary. Yet each small change, each adaptation, only delayed the recognition of a larger trend: the system itself was becoming unsustainable. This teaches us a chilling truth: the deadliest threats are often those that move quietly, invisibly, and over long periods, eroding foundations without dramatic fanfare. Human migration is another lesson the Indus collapse leaves behind. As water became unreliable and agricultural productivity declined, entire populations were compelled to relocate. The so-called climate refugees of Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and other cities were not fleeing invaders, they were making rational decisions in response to environmental pressures they could neither resist nor control. Families, craftsmen, and traders moved along river valleys, toward areas where rainfall and groundwater were still sufficient, or farther east toward the Ganges plains, where survival was possible. This migration reshaped the subcontinent, dispersing knowledge, skills, and cultural practices to new regions. Civilization endured in fragments, but the monumental urban centers that had defined the Indus were left behind. Survival required mobility, flexibility, and the courage to abandon what could no longer be sustained. Ironically, the very features that had made the Indus Valley Civilization remarkable, urban planning, technological innovation, social cohesion, also created its hidden vulnerability. Mastery over infrastructure, agriculture, and trade meant that the society had become finely tuned to the environment it had known. Once that environment shifted beyond tolerable limits, the civilization had little buffer. The collapse demonstrates that human achievement, even at its highest, is never divorced from ecological conditions. Success breeds sophistication, but sophistication can mask fragility, making slow collapse possible without immediate recognition. The ultimate lesson is simple, yet profound: civilizations are inseparable from the natural systems they depend upon. Rivers, rainfall, soil fertility, and climatic stability are not just background conditions, they are integral to the survival of complex societies. The Indus Valley Civilization was a triumph of human skill and organization, a beacon of early urban life, but it stands as a stark reminder that no society can escape the laws of nature. As rivers dried, cities emptied, and populations migrated, the Indus people may have left behind streets, baths, granaries, and walls, but they carried forward knowledge of adaptation, resilience, and the delicate balance between human ambition and environmental reality. That knowledge, invisible yet enduring, is perhaps the civilization's greatest legacy, a warning that even the most sophisticated human systems are ultimately bound by the rhythms and limits of the natural world. About 4,000 years later, their story resonates, urging us to respect and understand the fragile interplay between people and the environment, and to recognize that even brilliance is vulnerable when nature itself shifts its course.